Welcome back to PC Builder. I'm Jason. Was I wrong to recommend AMD Radeon GPUs over their NVIDIA counterparts, especially given the differences between DLSS and FSR? We'll also talk about when can we expect next generation GPUs like the RX 8000 series, Battlemage, and of course the RTX 5090. How many years should your PC build last? And of course, when's the best time to buy PC parts with Amazon Prime Day, Black Friday, and the holiday shopping season upon us? Remember, if you get value out of this video, please give it a like. This makes a huge difference to the channel, and of course, subscribe for more cool PC content. With that, let's jump into it. This video is sponsored by VIP SCD Key. Say goodbye to crazy expensive Windows licenses and that terrible Activate Windows watermark. Right now, use the links in the video description, head over to VIP SCD Key and get a Windows 10 or 11 OEM license for a great price. Pick your product license, then use the PC Builder discount code PC25 for an additional 25% off. Go to the activation settings on your PC, put in the code, and boom! Windows is fully licensed for a crazy low price. And Windows 10 can be upgraded for free to Windows 11. And they have Microsoft Office licenses too. Use the links in the video description. We've got Anton. Anton says, what's going on with AMD turning away from future high-end GPUs for high-end graphics cards? How do you think it will affect the market? Listen, I first want to reframe this question a little bit. Not Anton, it's not your fault. It's that a lot of tech outlets are kind of reporting this, I feel like, incorrectly. AMD isn't making a decision to turn away from high-end graphics cards. Their high-end graphics cards for the 8000 series didn't work. They were not functional. They're trying to go to a multi-chip module, the same way that Ryzen went to a chiplet style, right? In the CPUs, it's allowed them to kind of scale things, redistribute, and get a lot of cost savings out of that while increasing the performance. They're hoping to do the same thing with GPUs. They were able to get it working with the 7000 series. However, remember their performance targets for the 7000 series that they made public, they never hit those. They actually didn't even come close. That being said, the 7900 XTX, still a super fast GPU. It beats an RTX 4080 in terms of raw rasterization, but they were hoping that it would compete with the RTX 4090, which it never ended up doing because they were only able to get it to work to a certain level. The 8000 series they thought was going to be their big jump. Unfortunately, they literally just couldn't get the thing to work at all the way they were hoping. So what they're shipping now for RX 8000, or what they eventually will ship for RX 8000 series GPUs, is just all the monolithic stuff out there, not the chiplet stuff, the monolithic stuff. So that'll be like the 8800 XT or whatever they decide to call the GPUs. It's the mid-range to lower end GPUs out there, not the high-end stuff that they were hoping to do. And I know AMD tried to put on this face like, oh, it was a business decision because all this stuff's really in the mid-range. No. They're putting the best face on this they can. They ultimately fail to produce these high-end GPUs. And listen, sometimes when you take risks out there to innovate, which I appreciate AMD trying to do, you have failures like this. So it just happens. And it's lucky that this didn't happen to them when they were doing this with Ryzen CPUs back in like 2016, 2017, because the company was in such a place right then that a failure for Ryzen would effectively mean that AMD probably would have gone bankrupt at this point and they would be off the map altogether. And all we would have is Intel and NVIDIA. And you'd literally have to buy their products and you would have no one else to turn to. And we already know how they function in terms of how all these companies function, even including AMD, when they've got the best or they feel like you can't go anywhere else. So I do expect AMD to get back to high-end GPUs. They are reportedly accelerating the next generation of CPU architecture that will include those multi-chip module GPUs. It's just not going to come anytime in the next probably year and a half or something like that. In the meantime, they are going with more mid-range offerings, and I think they are going to change their business strategy where they're going to try and compete super hard on price to performance. At least that's what they're promising. I'm skeptical given where the 7600 XT pricing came in. I told them it needed to be $299. They decided to charge $330 for it, right? All of us out here in the tech community saying this is where this thing really needs to be priced to kind of really be aggressive, and they just haven't done it. Despite the fact that they do have, you can look at their earnings reports, they have the margins to be able to compete. They're just deciding not to accept lower margins. A lot of us, at least on the Radeon side, wonder, is AMD really trying to compete with NVIDIA out there, or are they just basically using the Radeon GPUs as a way to develop the next generation of consoles, which is what they're really kind of focused on, and laptops? It does make you wonder sometimes, but I think in terms of the high-end market market, NVIDIA is going to go ahead and charge as much as they can get for the 5090. I think they're going to not feel constrained whatsoever. They already don't feel that constrained. I think you're going to see some stupid high prices on that, especially the fact that NVIDIA has gotten super into AI, and most of their money right now is coming from AI. That basically 10 out of every $11 that they make comes from AI data center. And only like $1 out of that $11 basically comes from, if I have my math right, comes from gaming right now. So you can see if almost all of your money comes from this stuff over here, and you're only getting a little sliver over here, you just kind of feel like anything you put into this little sliver over here is just costing you money where you could have done it over here, right? You could have used that silicon in AI. So whatever they produce over here, I expect it's going to be super expensive. I expect that they're going to continue what they did in the previous generation. That's why when you got an RTX 4060, it used the 107 die instead of the 106 die. It used a kind of a more cut down die than they typically use. NVIDIA would have normally called that the RTX 4050. Instead, they call it the 4060. They slapped 8 gigabytes of RAM on it and said, hey, look, you've got a new 60 series card. And you're like, but it barely outcompetes the 3060, and the 3060 has 12 gigs of RAM. So what the heck's going on here? That's what I would expect next generation from NVIDIA, but more at the high end. In terms of the mid-range, I do expect AMD to be much more aggressive in terms of price and performance. At least that's my hope. So I think we're going to see some relief in that like $600 price range and below. All right, Sven's calling me out. He's saying his question is, why do I keep recommending AMD GPUs for non-budget builds when FSR is vastly, I think you mean vastly inferior to DLSS. Vastly inferior to DLSS according to Sven. And Sven, thank you very much for submitting the question. We do get this quite a lot, so that's why I picked this one out. I definitely want to respond to it. Am I wrong for recommending AMD GPUs over their NVIDIA counterparts both in this generation and in previous generations as well? I don't think so. First of all, I challenge that FSR is vastly inferior to DLSS. Frankly, I use both the technologies. I have two different PCs, one with an RTX 4090 and this one with a 7900 XT, and I played both of them on the same exact Gigabyte M28U monitor, and I played similar games, and I used DLSS on the one out in the front room, and in here in the studio, I used FSR, obviously with the AMD GPU, because you can't use DLSS. And I don't notice the difference even at 4K. And I would say, I don't think even the people who test this stuff on Hardware Unboxed has done some fantastic testing. I don't disagree with their testing, by the way. I want to be very, very clear about this. I disagree with people taking their testing and then making these kinds of statements about them, right? Taking other people's data and making those kind of statements. In my experience, they are more or less the same. The differences between them are extremely minor. It's stuff that you have to pause a video, pause a game as you're playing it, and then zoom in 200 to 300% to see that the difference in the detail. And if you do that, you can see that DLSS is technically superior to FSR. But would anyone actually be able to tell the difference if I set up two different stations, like the Linus Tech Tips did this a while back with SSDs? They had a Gen 4, a Gen 3, and a SATA SSD. And a lot of people pick the SATA SSD as the fastest feeling one out of those, even though it's clearly not the fastest. So I think if you did the same thing with FSR, XeSS, and DLSS on similar games at 4K, you'd have people saying, oh no, this is the best, but it's just down to their perception. And I feel like at this point, they are close enough that most gamers would not really be able to tell the difference between the two of them. So then it comes down to, why am I recommending AMD GPUs? Simply because they offer significantly more performance for your dollar, significantly more performance. In fact, to the point where you can render these games, if you had a certain amount of money to spend on an AMD and NVIDIA GPU, the AMD GPU that you will get will give you so many more frames that you could just do native. You don't even need upscaling a lot of times to match DLSS output on the NVIDIA GPU. That's how crazy the price to performance has become. And on top of that, we've got VRAM, right? NVIDIA has been so stingy with the VRAM. Would you rather have right now an RTX 3080 10 gigabyte GPU that you probably spent like $2,000 for during the height of the craziness, the GPU shortage, or would you rather have an RX 6800 XT or 6950 XT Usually the 6950 XT sold for actually even a little bit below or right around the same price as the RTX 3080. Which one of those would you rather have? Well, obviously you'd rather have the Radeon GPUs with significantly more VRAM, right? 16 gigs instead of 10 gigs of VRAM. It's even worse if you go down one more card to like the 3070 where you had 8 gigs of VRAM and it was like the same price most of the time as the 6800 XT with 16 gigabytes. So not only is the 6800 XT way faster, it's got 16 gigs of VRAM versus 8. And that 3070 today, if you bought one like I did when our channel was kind of not even really that big at the time, so I was just really an ordinary person buying the 3070 basic on name recognition on NVIDIA, 8 gigs of VRAM, I feel like I made a huge mistake. I should have gotten a 6800 XT for about the same price at the time. And if you look at our current generation of GPUs, under $600, where do you go for an NVIDIA GPU that has similar performance? I'd also say I base a lot of this stuff not necessarily on what I want or I would recommend, but also on what you want, audience. So we do a lot of polling here in our community tab. This is a poll we did a couple of months ago. When buying a new GPU for gaming, what was the number one most important thing to them? 17,000 votes out there. I don't think that's a small amount to take a poll. 17,000 people voted. And number one just absolutely destroyed everything else. Most raw FPS for my budget. 88% said that. 88%. Only 3% said best ray tracing. Only 4% said ability to use DLSS on NVIDIA. Only 2% said ability to use frame generation, and 3% said something else. 88% of you want the most raw FPS for your budget. So then I did a follow-up poll basically. Okay, I get it. Most raw FPS, number one. But what's number two? What's the number two most important thing out there? And 74% of you said getting the most VRAM for your budget, basically for the amount you're spending on your card. Only 9% said getting an NVIDIA GPU for DLSS upscaling. Remember, this is not the top. This is for the second. This is for the second feature. Only 9% said even that for the second feature. And then 6% said aesthetic color options like color options, RGB, no RGB. Ability to do a high-end ray tracing and path tracing was only 6%. So again, this is on the second feature. Number one feature, overwhelmingly FPS. Number two feature, overwhelmingly VRAM. Well, what cards kind of answer that call, if you will, right now? Primarily they're AMD GPUs outside of the RTX 4070 Ti Super, which we have been recommending, especially if you want to do high-end ray tracing and you want to get the card that's the best value for it because it's got 16 gigs of VRAM and it has pretty dang good ray tracing performance out there. But you can see ray tracing is not a huge percent. And this is not, again, 17,000 people voted in this poll as well. So just kind of highlighting, I just decided to pull up some stats here, just highlighting this is more in the mid-range. This is the TechSpot RX 7600 XT review. This is 1440p performance data, 12 game average. They usually use relatively hard to run, more single player titles out there. So when you do those like non-single player titles, you know, multiplayer shooters and stuff like that, you get tons and tons more FPS. And this is ultra settings. And again, I recommend playing games on high rather than ultra. That way you get more FPS because it's usually not worth the FPS hit. If you want to spend like anywhere from $300 to $450, what GPU you gonna get right now? For $380, you can get the 7700 XT, 92 average FPS, 12 gigs of VRAM. What do you get for $400 from NVIDIA? RTX 4060 Ti 8 gigabyte GPU. 8 gigabyte GPU that's going to give you 79 average FPS, but look at those 1% lows, and that's because some of the titles, they're running out of VRAM basically. So the 1% lows are awful at 55%, and this is 55 FPS rather. And this is, again, this is a 12 game average. So there are some titles in there where VRAM doesn't make a difference, and that's kind of probably propping up that card. But how long do you expect that card to be relevant for? But switching over to more high-end GPUs, because I know you said outside of budget, and I don't know what you consider budget. I wouldn't consider dropping $400 on a GPU necessarily budget out there, right? But let's push that up a little bit. So this is the Tech Power Up Sapphire RX 7900 GRE review. So again, relatively recent data, 1440p. This is average FPS. I think it's like a 23 game average out there. And again, mostly harder to run, single player titles, and I believe ultra details out there. Right now you can get two different GPUs with relatively the same performance. That's the RTX 4070 Super at 118 average FPS or the RX 7900 GRE with 119 average FPS. One of those GPUs has 12 gigs of VRAM. One of those GPUs has 16 gigs of VRAM. Which of those GPUs do you think is going to be relevant for longer? And I'm just going to tell you right now, I wouldn't be buying a GPU over $400, I should say, with less than 16 gigs of VRAM. I just absolutely would not do it right now. And that's why I backed away from the RTX 4070 Super and 4070 the way I have increasingly. especially as we get more and more evidence that 12 gigs is not going to be enough for ray tracing workloads. Ray tracing, remember, ray tracing, DLSS, frame generation, what do they all do? They all increase VRAM usage. And what is the thing that's really constraining these NVIDIA GPUs? It's VRAM, especially given the fact that, again, at least in my estimation, the difference between FSR and DLSS is very minor, but the difference between 16 gigs of VRAM and 12 gigs of VRAM is likely to be very, very major in the future, especially when NVIDIA rests a lot of its laurels on ray tracing right now, which, again, testing has shown that you really need like 16 gigs of VRAM in order to ray trace at 1440p, and I would just recommend going up in resolution instead, getting those better looking textures or higher quality textures instead of adding the ray tracing in. That's going to improve your gameplay. But what about next generation GPUs? That's what Nelson and Rick want to know. Rick says, for someone who's new to component launches, when should we expect more information about AMD's RX 8000 series and NVIDIA's RTX 5000 series to come through? Is there a specific date release season? Yes. Typically, we're in it right now. That is why it's so weird that we're not getting the kind of rumors that we normally get before a GPU launch in terms of all the performance stuff and the cards are shipping and all this kind of stuff. Could they pull a fast one on us, basically? That's what Moore's Law is Dead, another YouTube channel out there, who often gets a lot of stuff leaked to him from AMD, from industry folks. He's saying that basically we should expect RX 8000 series GPUs to be launched this fall. Now listen, I hope that's the case. In fact, AMD didn't announce their RX 7000 series GPUs until I think it was like sometime in late October or around November, like 17th or something like that, which is kind of crazy, which was kind of late. Now we know it was kind of late because they couldn't get those multi-chip modules to work properly and they were still furiously trying to fix it and work on it. But it could be that this year we're going to get those GPU launches. In terms of Battlemage is the other one. Intel Battlemage, which we're hearing so much about with the Lunar Lake testing just came out, the Lunar Lake mobile GPUs, and it does look like massive improvements have been made to that Xe2 GPU architecture that Intel's been working on that we're, fingers crossed, hopeful to see in their Battlemage architecture. We're now seeing some leaked benchmarks out there from Battlemage. So I'm hopeful. I am hopeful that we'll get at least Battlemage and we'll get the RX 8000 series GPUs. Otherwise, it does look like next year. NVIDIA, could they launch? We heard that they were ready to launch the 5090, but then it seems that they made a business decision because they can't launch the 5090 into China because the United States government has an AI technology ban on products being shipped into China. And the 4090 doesn't make that list. It's basically banned from being able to ship into China. So obviously the 5090 is not going to be able to be shipped into China. So they wanted to do a global launch because NVIDIA is absolutely dominant in China in terms of the GPU market. And they don't want to give any of that market share up. Rather than offend the Chinese market and not be able to have it be a global launch, they want to launch the 5080 first, and they'll launch the 5090 shortly thereafter, basically. And then China will at least get the 5080. But we've heard that the 5080 wasn't quite ready to go out the way the 5090 was. So it's a lot of leaks, a lot of conjecture right now, not a lot of solid information. Fingers crossed that we actually do get some of these GPU architectures sooner rather than later. But when's the best time to buy PC parts? What about all the sales coming up? We got Amazon Prime Day in October. We've got Black Friday. We've got the holiday shopping season, Cyber Monday through the end of the year, and even some good deals in January. And the Soviet X-Men wants to know, I know nobody has a crystal ball, but when's the best time of the year to buy parts for a PC? They've got no problem waiting months and months for a good deal. The good news is you don't have to wait months and months. I've gone back and I've looked at Amazon Prime Day, both in 2023 and in 2022, and even before that, and I found that typically the discounts that you're going to get around those big sales, at least on GPUs, range in the 5 to 10% category. For CPUs, it may be up to 20% sometimes. And for other components, it can be even more significant, If you're waiting for just a GPU, that's why I typically don't recommend, if you just want to buy a GPU, waiting for some big sale, because the discounts just never come through the way I think a lot of people are hoping that they will. Except on something like the 6700 XT, where AMD they're just clearly trying to clear out the rest of that stock and get ready for even the next generation GPUs out there. That's why they've cut the price on that thing so far down. But outside of those kind of unicorn sales or super clearance items, you're not typically going to find massive discounts on a GPU. CPUs are pretty good. Motherboards are much better. You do see some pretty good discounts on RAM, on SSD, especially SSDs, power supplies, and other things like that if you're looking for a brand new build. So I would get super excited. We know that Amazon Prime Day in October is going to be October 8th and 9th. We'll have content around there. So stay subscribed if you want to see some great deals. We put out deals on our community page. We also put deals out on Twitter. So follow us at Twitter. I'll leave a link to that down in the video description as well. Speaking of upcoming sales, I know a lot of you out there have older systems and you're thinking about, should I upgrade now? Should I wait? Like, what's the best thing to do? Jay Brinks asked, do I prefer to hang on to a build for a certain number of years and then rebuild from scratch, or do a continuous upgrade? And Hazard Riot, basically similar question. Is having an upgrade path important for all PC builds? Feel like if you have a high-end PC, you should stick with it for at least 4 to 5 years, and by then new platforms would have arrived. I will say that we have been used to, in the past, relatively large upgrades, basically gen on gen. So especially on the Ryzen side, if you look at Ryzen 1000 to 2000, that was a big jump. Ryzen 2000 to 3000, even bigger jump. Ryzen 3000 to 5000, because they decided to stop going with the even numbers for some reason back then, even more massive. And then we got the X3D CPUs, and then Ryzen 7000, not as big of a jump, but pretty significant still. The problem with Ryzen 7000 was at the time, DDR5 RAM was expensive. You had to go onto a new platform. You needed a new motherboard. The motherboards were expensive. They fixed most of that pricing wise. The market has fixed that. So unfortunately, with Ryzen 9000, we didn't see that uplift. This is the first time AMD has failed to deliver a significant uplift in their next generation of CPUs. So there's a lot of folks who say, hey, I want an upgrade path, which is that I want to be able to use the same motherboard, probably the same RAM, at least the same SSD, the same power supply, the same setup, just drop in a new CPU upgrade. And obviously the thing that you can always upgrade is the GPU. Just drop in a new GPU, should continue to work just fine. In terms of how long you should hang on to a build, I mean, listen, it's going to depend on how good a job you do in terms of getting your best price to performance right now. If you invest all your money in aesthetics, you might feel like that build kind of doesn't really last as long as maybe it should, because you invested most of your money in terms of getting aesthetic, or maybe you spent way too much on your SSDs. We go through these and Boost My Build all the time. Imagine some of the builds that people submit initially if they then had that build for 3 years versus the builds we're able to build with the same budget, basically, by just tweaking their component choices in order to give them a lot more performance. And that's going to basically stretch out the number of years that they're going to feel like their PC, their gaming PC largely, is really cutting the mustard, versus some of those builds where it just feels like it's not really lasting as long as it used to. And a lot of that does come down to component choices. I know a lot of people want to blame technology is going faster, and technology is going faster, by the way. So that's a real thing, but also it comes down to your skill as a PC builder. And I also think it comes down to how much feedback that you're willing to listen to in your PC build to get the most out of it right now. I has peppers, not a question, but the RTX 4090 and RTX 4090D have stopped production. Just thought it was worth mentioning. So what do we think about that? Because I read the same rumor. We should all remember that just because they've stopped production of the actual dies themselves, right, the wafers themselves, doesn't mean that you're not going to see the 4090 for probably quite some time at retail. So it just means that they've stopped that part of the production process, and without those last GPUs, it will take a while to kind of wind them through. And I also know that NVIDIA does not want to end up with a lot of unsold RTX 4000 series products when they're announcing RTX 5000 series products, at least the higher end ones, right? Because that's what happened with RTX 3000 series GPUs. They just had tons and tons of them because they massively overproduced, because they thought the cryptocurrency boom was going to go on forever, and they ended up with just tons and tons of extra GPUs. And that's why it was such a good time to build a gaming PC in 2022, 2023, and even 2024. But in terms of the RTX 4090 and 4090D ending production as some kind of harbinger that we're going to get an announcement for RTX 5000 series launched in the fall, I don't necessarily see that as the possibility, sure, but I think this would have happened earlier if we were going to get in the fall. This to me seems like we're going to get an announcement in 2025, because it's a couple months ahead of time. They want to end production. They want the stock of these things to dry up, so they're not left having to discount these cards. Of course, if you got value out of this video, please do give it a like. It makes a huge difference to the channel. And of course, subscribe for more cool PC content. What kind of PC content? Did you check out our part 1 Q&A where we talked about the 7800 X3D? Where is it? It's out of stock everywhere, or it's super overpriced. What the heck is going on with that? Check it out, and we'll catch you on the next one.